So far, our travels down Australia's road of time have taken us from the very formation of the Earth, through the forging of the continent, to the origin of life and the conquest of the land.
Your destination is the present day.
But it's only now, as we race towards our modern world, that the familiar face of Australia is finally revealed. This is the story of how an island continent became isolated from the rest of the world, and how the life aboard this wandering ark adapted to a changing landscape. But it's a rocky road we travel. When the age of the dinosaurs came to a dead stop 65 million years ago, a great darkness settled over the planet, and the whole course of evolution shifted. When the skies began to clear in the first grim days of the Paleogene, most of the great Cretaceous forests were gone. But life on Earth is tenacious. Ferns were quick to take advantage of the new world, colonising what was left of the damaged forests of Australia, Antarctica and New Zealand. And following closely behind the ferns, a remarkable Australian tree made a dramatic comeback in the post-apocalyptic world. This is its microscopic seed, found fossilised amongst the fern spores just above the level of the asteroid debris that marks the last days of the dinosaurs. Like a B-grade monster, this is a tree that is hard to kill. It's the Huon pine. Every branch that falls can resprout from the ground. This entire tangled glade is a clone from a single original ancient tree. Now, the Huon pine is more than just one of Australia's great Gondwanan survivors. This particular tree is thought to be Australia's oldest living organism. It's been growing on this same spot, the cold, wet, windy slopes of Mount Reid in Tasmania, for over 10,000 years. But while life was on the rebound, the supercontinent Gondwana was in its death throes, and the consequences for Australia would be dramatic. India and New Zealand had already slipped away. Now Antarctica and Australia were being torn apart. First, a great rift valley opened up and widened. Then Australia and Antarctica started to unzip from the west. A trickle became a flood as a new Southern Ocean surged into the gap between the separating lands. Only Tasmania stood firm, holding the two continents together. Today, Tasmania wears its war wounds with pride. For over 100 million years, intruding molten rock had been forcing its way upwards, looking for a weak spot. This is the volcanic dolerite rock that now dominates Tasmania. There's more of this rock here than anywhere else on Earth. Towering dolerite sea cliffs guard the coast. Dolerite punches through the highlands, and the rock glowers over the capital of Hobart itself. All indelible evidence of the dying days of Gondwana. This was a torrid time across the planet. Although much of the Australian landmass still lay within the Antarctic Circle, the climate was warm rather than polar, thanks to a sudden surge of greenhouse gases that peaked around 55 million years ago. In this steamy world, the conifers that had dominated the forests of the dinosaurs were now being replaced by broad-leafed, flowering rainforest trees. Some live on, here in Tasmania's forests. These leaves belong to a characteristic Gondwanan tree, the southern beech, Notophagus. You can still find Notophagus on the Australian mainland, in South America, and even Antarctica as fossils. They're a reminder of the days when Tasmania was holding the last of the Gondwanan Brotherhood together. At the time, you could have walked all the way from Australia via Tasmania and Antarctica to South America without ever leaving the green embrace of the great Gondwanan forest. And it was through this green transantarctic highway that marsupial mammals scurried out of the forests of South America and onto Australian soil. Marsupials, mammals with a pouch to carry their young, now dominate Australia. But marsupials were neither the first nor the only mammals in the country. They found themselves mingling with the monotremes, curious furry enigmas like the platypus that still laid eggs. A legacy from their distant reptilian ancestors. Only 2 types of monotreme live on our planet today, and they're both a little peculiar. Now this little guy, of course, he's a truly famous Australian. It's the echidna or tachyglossus, and it's one of the true survivors for the early ages mammals, and we know that because it lays eggs like the platypus. He's tunnelling to China, I think. But there's another group of survivors from those Mesozoic times with even closer reptilian affinities than the echidna. And they still inhabit the forests of their forebears. One type of feathered dinosaur did survive the Great Extinction. Today, we call them birds. Come eye to eye with the flightless cassowary, and the close family connection is hard to miss. While cassowaries owe their existence to the dinosaurs, the rainforests of tropical Queensland owe their existence to the birds. It's a chain of connection that links down through time, all the way to the Hewitt family, modern human residents of the ancient rainforest at Cooper Creek. The cassowary has evolved to become a modern distributor a job likely first done by herbivorous dinosaurs.
This is the cassowary plum. The cassowary is the only animal large enough to be able to swallow this fruit whole, and in doing so, increase its germination rate from 7% to an ultimate 92%.
In a complex relationship for mutual advantage, at least 37 species of rainforest tree rely on the cassowary for dispersal. It's a big job, but someone's got to do it.
Swanton Peak is the place that gets well over 10 metres...
Neil Hewitt makes a living here too, sharing the rich botanical heritage of his 130-million-year-old back garden with visitors like me.
Here in the Cooper Valley is the world's richest diversity of primitive flowering plant families found anywhere on the planet.
These rainforests are extremely old, far older than the Amazon, and probably the oldest continuously surviving jungle in the world. Today, they cover less than 1% of the surface of Australia. It seems hard to believe that for so many millions of years, most of this now arid continent was festooned with forests of almost unimaginable richness. All that changed the moment that Tasmania finally let go of Antarctica. And with the apron strings torn asunder sometime between 30 and 40 million years ago, Australia sailed free from the rest of the world.
When not only Australia, but the Patagonian tip of South America also let go of Antarctica, cold ocean currents were able to sweep freely around the southern continent for the very first time. And Antarctica's fate was sealed.
Encircled by icy currents, Antarctica and all who sailed on her began to freeze solid. Australia, loaded to the gunwales with Gondwanan refugees, set course for the tropics. A raft of life, adrift on a sea of change. And as it drifted, it dried. It was more than a passage into warmer climates. The freezing of Antarctica had taken much of the planet's available fresh water with it. This was the trigger for one of the planet's great biological experiments. Isolated and alone now, Australia's plants and animals began taking on their own unique identity. A remarkable rocky record of this defining moment has been found at Riversley in northwest Queensland. When the fossil window reopens in the rugged limestone hills here, it opens with a bang. For prehistoric animal hunters like Mike Archer, Riversley is one of the richest caches on the continent.
We know nothing about Australia's mammals right through the period when Australia separated from Antarctica at 35 million years ago, until suddenly the window is thrown open and there are thousands of fascinating things to look at. They document the last 26 million years of Australian history in exquisite detail.
With every fossil-rich boulder recovered and bone, tooth and jaw released from acid bath, the ancient animals of Riverslea are telling their own backstory of Neogene Australia. It was in the Neogene that Australia began to show its true colours.
The beginning of Riverslee's story was of a rich forest. Cool, temperate, permanently wet, no seasons. So we started thinking about this as a kind of a green cradle. Here were the first brush-tail possums. Here were the first ringtail possums. Here were the first koalas. All the things people think about today as typically Australian animals had their roots in these ancient rainforests.
By the time Riverslee's window into time was closing, around 15 million years ago, the rainforests had begun their long retreat. As the continent edged closer to the equator, the blooms of many new types of flowering plants started bursting out across the land. Amongst them, a previously low-profile, low-spreading plant took root. Grass. For the first time, extensive grasslands spread out across the continent, ready for the nibbling. Think Australia, and one grass-grazing animal above all others leaps to mind.
Kangaroos are the archetypical successful mammal in Australia. They've taken over every ecological niche, from the tropical rainforests, in the treetops there, through to the harshest deserts in Australia. And they do something that no other large mammal does, which is to hop.
Perhaps the most energy-efficient means of forward motion developed by a mammal, hopping allows kangaroos to move vast distances over a tough country. The quintessential Australian they may be, but how did such a biological oddity come about?
So if you can take
The largest kangaroos of all time. Brocoptodon Goliath grew over 2 metres tall.
It all relates to the fact that larger animals have a much lower metabolic rate, and that means they can survive on much rougher, less nutritious vegetation, becoming more and more widespread across Australia as the country dried out. And of course the carnivores, the meat eaters, get bigger because the herbivores get bigger.
This is the skull of Thylacoleo, Australia's marsupial super carnivore. It had stealth, speed, and a bite force without mammalian equal. Thylacoleo was the top mammalian predator in Ice Age Australia. But not for long. A placental mammal made landfall somewhere on the northern coastline. It didn't fly in like the bats, or swim like the rats. This mammal must have come by boat.
The first human footsteps on Australian soil were made somewhere between here in the Kimberley and Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory. The people came out of the setting sun from Indonesia in the northwest, and they came a staggeringly long time ago.
Modern science is now able to put dates on the arrival of the first people. Geochronologist Bert Roberts uses sand grains and laser light to peer back to the start of the human story.
So using the very best techniques we can at the present stage, We now think that people got to Australia maybe 50 or 60,000 years ago. And the very earliest occupations took place in the north of the country, maybe through Kakadu, maybe through the Kimberley.
Wherever those first people landed, they found themselves on a lonely, alien coastline. With the oceans rising behind them and a dangerous welcoming committee, they pushed on.
Once you push your way through the mangroves, you would have found a world unlike anything that you'd seen. There would have been gigantic tortoises with horns like a cow.
So there was a giant flightless goose-like bird called Genyornis.
Huge wombats, huge kangaroos, giant echidnas, even giant koalas.
60 species of short-faced kangaroos.
And giant goannas, about 5 times the size of a Komodo dragon.
It was a land of plenty. From the beachheads of the tropical north, it seems the first people spread rapidly south. Following the coast and tracking inland along the watercourses, they penetrated deep into the heart of the continent. Within only a few thousand years, it seems, people were camped by the shores of Lake Mungo in far western New South Wales. In 1969, fragments of a cremated skeleton were found weathering out of the bone-dry lakeshore. A second discovery soon followed. With dates firming at around 40,000 years, these are the oldest human remains yet found on the continent, and some of the oldest ritual burials in the world.
Roger that, stone 4 done.
This is bone 5.
The crumbling clay of the prehistoric lake edge is still releasing secrets. Animal dinners cooked on fires amongst the dunes. Fragments of stone tools. Relics that speak to archaeologist Nicholas Stern of distant times. Changed climates and a forgotten landscape.
My interest is primarily in the rubbish left behind from people's everyday life. It's a record that spans the entire history of human settlement on the continent, about which we know very little.
Clues left behind in the lakeside cooking fires paint a picture of lakes brimming with water and fish, fringed with trees and wildlife. A different Mungo from today.
Mungo is a magic and moving place. You can walk in a landscape where people have been leaving footprints for over 50,000 years. There's few places on the planet with such a continual record of human occupation. Half close your eyes and you can almost hear the sounds of the people camped on the shoreline and enjoying a sunset, much like this.
There are other ghosts in this landscape. Even before the first human burials here, the giant animals of the megafauna had disappeared from the continent. The timing alone suggests human involvement, but this remains a scientific cold case, hotly debated. Some suspect that the shifting Ice Age climate did them in. But the records stored in the bone beds of Naracoorte suggest otherwise.
Populations of different species of mammal waxed and waned, if you like, in response to those glacial interglacial cycles. But nothing became extinct until about the time humans arrived.
Whatever it was that killed these giant animals, a final desiccating wave of global glaciation was soon making life tough for the humans that survived them. At its peak, around 20,000 years ago, the bountiful land faltered. Forced back to the security of the lakes, Mungo people marked their passage on the edge of a drying clay pan. But these first Australians left behind more than footprints. Rock shelters on the Kimberley coast hold a collection of cultural evolution extending back, it's suspected, as far as the last ice age.
With the arrival of the first people, the story of Australia is written not only in the rocks, but on them as well. Rocks polished smooth by the rub of countless human bodies, an artwork to rival any modern gallery.
It's the art gallery that never closed, still cared for by the artist's living descendants, like Warrnambool man Greg Goonak.
Oh, hi.
Hello.
Greg.
Hey. Hello, welcome to Warrnambool country.
Pleased to meet you. I'm so glad to be here. It's just so impressive.
This is a collection of artwork that archaeologist June Ross and her team are keen to fully document and date.
It is the story of Australia. It's a story of the people who were here first, but people have lived here very successfully for thousands and thousands of years, and we're very interested in knowing how they managed to do that.
Recorded here are clues to how people adapted to the evolving climate. At least 3 conspicuously different styles are on display in the caverns. The oldest are slender, elongated figures.
They appear to be floating, almost standing on their toes like ballet dancers. But the thing that fascinates me is all the different hairstyles and headdresses.
This flamboyant style is then replaced by more businesslike figures.
So we think something's happening to the culture at this particular time. See a lot more weapons, the barbed spears, the hook sticks.
Whether or not dating will show this cultural shift was a response to a changing world, an evolving tropical climate certainly influenced the art of the last few thousand years.
Mullingy! Mullingy! Come with respect.
Wandjina figures, like these images of the creator spirit Gorlingi, are strong cultural links to the modern monsoon, each wet bringing new life to the land.
When I arrived at this site for the first time, it took my breath away. And I think it has the potential to answer lots of highly significant questions, not just for Australians, but for the entire world.
Across the country, Aboriginal Australians were witness to extraordinary change. They saw people walk to Tasmania, the last volcanic eruptions on Australian soil, and then the coming of the Europeans. When navigator James Cook climbed to the summit of Lizard Island in 1770, after running aground on Endeavour Reef, he was horrified to find that his ship and crew were trapped inside a coral labyrinth, the extent of which exceeded his worst nightmares. A maze of over 3,000 reefs and islands, extending over 1,200 miles along the coast. Australia's Great Barrier Reef is probably one of the greatest reef systems the planet has ever seen. But Cook climbed up here for salvation, not scenery. He was looking for a way out. Surprisingly, if Cook had come only about 10,000 years earlier, he wouldn't have seen the reef at all. His view from the coast to the horizon would have been of dry land, because the Barrier Reef hadn't arrived yet. At the height of the last ice age, sea levels plunged over 300 feet. And the older reefs were left high and dry. Aborigines would have walked where sharks now swim, hunting kangaroos on hillsides that fish now graze. As the Ice Age waned and the world thawed, the seas rose yet again. Coral larvae drifted in to reclaim the seafloor. Today's Great Barrier Reef, so big you can see it from space, is a surprisingly new arrival on the Australian stage. And so, for the most part, are we. In many ways, you can think of James Cook's climb here to the summit of Lizard Island as a kind of turning point, the place from where our modern, still unfolding chapter of Australia's long story began. Because it's from here that he spied an escape route back to England, and the modern world soon followed. It was like a collision of continents, a sudden end to a long isolation. In the blink of a geological eye, humans have altered the continent forever. We've cleared and cultivated the land, losing prehistoric forests and ancient soils in the process. The rest of the world has been brought in with us in the form of animals and plants, pests and diseases. And much of what did live here has gone.
Well, in here, Richard, really is the cabinet of catastrophe.
Look at them all.
This cabinet's full of mammal species that no longer exist. You know, what we've got here is a desert rat kangaroo, last seen in 1931, Central Australia.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Oh, look at the beautiful black subterminal bands. And these are short-faced potoroos. Last time these were seen, 1875. This is a pig-footed bandicoot, last seen about 1906 in Central Australia.
And this is the final filmed record of the now extinct thylacine, the largest marsupial predator to make it into modern times.
Now, the reason this was persecuted, this animal, was because it supposedly killed sheep. We now know that 80% or so of the sheep that did die were stolen by convicts. They weren't killed by this animal.
What the film doesn't show is the moment when, in righteous indignation, the thylacine opened its remarkable marsupial jaws and bit the photographer firmly on his placental rear end. Many of Australia's marsupials remain at risk.
This extinction event is coupled with the one that happened 50,000 years ago, the giant megafauna. It's on the sort of scale that we see in the great prehistoric extinctions. It's the devastation of a continent.
As clear as the cosmic dust marking the last days of the dinosaurs, our our indelible radioactive signature is now being recorded in the rocks. The mark of the age of man. Around the world, we've become a powerful force of nature, the equal at least of any life form that has come before.
You shouldn't underestimate the power of life to shape the planet. After all, it was industrious prehistoric bacteria in the shape of stromatolites that created Australia's vast iron ore deposits. And it's us, life in the form of humans, that can shift whole mountains of the stuff to the other side of the world.
Each year now, humans shift more rock and soil than the flow of rivers and glaciers carries to the sea. And civilization is on track to burn as much energy each year as is released as heat from within the Earth. In doing all this, we alter the chemistry of our thin, precious atmosphere and finite oceans. And the geological extinction record shows we do so at our peril. We may now hold dominion over the Earth, but the planet always wins in the end. Almost nothing we see in the landscape of modern Australia will survive the test of geological time. Eventually, all this will go. The people, the buildings, probably the bedrock itself. Today's legacies will linger in the stories passed down in the rocks that are endlessly recycled. And so far, our travels down Australia's road of time have taken us from the very formation of the Earth, through the forging of the continent, to the origin of life and the conquest of the land.
Your destination is the present day.
But it's only now, as we race towards our modern world, that the familiar face of Australia is finally revealed. This is the story of how an island continent became isolated from the rest of the world, and how the life aboard this wandering ark adapted to a changing landscape. India and New Zealand had already slipped away. Now Antarctica and Australia were being torn apart. First, a great rift valley opened up and widened. Then Australia and Antarctica started to unzip from the west. A trickle became a flood as a new Southern Ocean surged into the gap between the separating lands. Only Tasmania stood firm, holding the two continents together. But it's a rocky road we travel. When the age of the dinosaurs came to a dead stop 65 million years ago, a great darkness settled over the planet, and the whole course of evolution shifted. When the skies began to clear in the first grim days of the Paleogene, most of the great Cretaceous forests were gone. But life on Earth is tenacious. Ferns were quick to take inch that falls can resprout from the ground. This entire tangled glade is a clone from a single original ancient tree. Now, the Huon pine is more than just one of Australia's great Gondwanan survivors. This particular tree is thought to be Australia's oldest living organism. It's been growing on this same spot, the cold, wet, windy slopes of Mount Reid in Tasmania, for over 10,000 years. But while life was on the rebound, the supercontinent Gondwana was in its death throes. And the consequences for Australia would be dramatic. Advantage of the New World, colonising what was left of the damaged forests of Australia, Antarctica and New Zealand. And following closely behind the ferns, a remarkable Australian tree made a dramatic comeback in the post-apocalyptic world. This is its microscopic seed, found fossilised amongst the fern spores just above the level of the asteroid debris that marks the last days of the dinosaurs. Like a B-grade monster, this is a tree that is hard to kill. It's the Huon pine. Every branch